coming to you live from Washington. Welcome back, and today, of course, we're talking about the African Union Summit. Now, we were talking about how the AU, at least, has reached a point where if some colonel takes power by means of AK-47, they are not going to do business as usual. In fact, you have to give it credit, especially with what happened in Egypt, when Mohamed Morsi was undemocratically removed from power. They recognized the fact that that was a coup, even though we know that some very important country in the West did not believe that.
Yes.
But what about the fact that, again, some of these African leaders have become very, very astute. They are very, very smart. They don't need to use the AK-47 anymore.
Yes.
In fact, they can use a pen.
Yes.
They can use, for example, fake elections. They can use fake referendums. They can also change constitutions, frankly, when they are still in power in order to benefit personally. Why can't the AU also now take up that issue and say, no, if you do that, we are not going to recognize you because, in fact, what you're doing is committing treason, violating your own country's constitution. What about that, Emira?
Well, I think that would be a step forward. I mean, clearly the AU having in place this lack of recognition for coups and coup plotters it's important that we applaud that, but it's got to be taking a step further to ensure that constitutions are manipulated and political processes are manipulated to keep leaders entrenched in power. So it's got to be the African Union with forward-looking strategies. Clearly, the African Union has succeeded in those forward-looking strategies when it comes to the UN Security Council. The African Union has put out, and it came out of this summit again, that changing the membership of the UN Security Council is an urgent matter for the continent, and ensuring that there is African representation in the permanent seats at the UN Security Council is long overdue. So clearly the African Union is able to provide that kind of leadership globally. And that's important. It's got to be applauded and strengthened to make sure that it goes from just the speeches to actually implementation, right? But internally, there have to also be forward-looking strategies to ensure that the will of the people throughout the continent is actually respected in the leadership that comes to power now and into the future.
When you talk about the will of the people, what exactly do you mean? Because even some of these dictators tell you that power belongs to the people.
Well, you have also some that say, you know, they are destined to be in power, and without them in power, the country will fall apart. And you have others who have said over the years that they will rule even if they have to rule over the trees. You have had these comments over the years. Huh? So I think what we have to recognize is that, whether it is opposition leaders, it's trade unions, it's youth movements, you have now technology that is expanding the space through which people express their will. But far too often, those expressions of popular sentiment are being overlooked, overshadowed, undermined, manipulated. The political space is shrinking throughout the continent, whether it's newspapers being closed and targeted or civil society organizations being closed and targeted. You know, these efforts to subvert the democratic process, to subvert the popular will, have to be stopped. And so I think what we're calling for really is an African Union that stands with the majority of those on the continent who are demanding transparency, who are demanding accountability, who are demanding that governments are actually servant leaders, that they are in service to their citizens, in service to the needs of their people, and not for their own personal aggrandizement.
Very interesting. Akuetteh, I have to admit that Emira is perhaps both an optimist and obviously somebody who means so well. Because when you look, for example, at the fact that the African Union has a very interesting clause, which is no indifference in the affairs of member countries, which was very different from the institution that preceded it, the OAU, which had the other clause of saying no interference in the internal affairs of member countries. Now, when you talk about that and you see what is happening in Burundi, you had a situation where the African Union from the beginning has actually been saying, no, we can't do business with Pierre Nkurunziza. Unless, of course, he meets his people, goes through a dialogue and negotiations and stuff like that, and stops whatever political crisis obtains in Burundi. They had identified, they said, 5,000 troops to be deployed in Burundi with or without the acceptance of the government in Bujumbura. What happened?
I think what happened was that in December, when the idea was floated, it was floated by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, which is sort of a committee made up of 15 countries. And the final approval has to come from the General Assembly, which is all 54 members meeting and having taken the decision by 2/3 majority, even the Peace and Security Council. So what we have been reading in the news had been floated, had been prepared, but the 2-day meeting that we just had Saturday and Sunday was supposed to approve it. And we heard that even in the Peace and Security Council, there were a number of countries who were saying, we are not sure this is a good idea, and I think for 2 reasons. Number one, this would have been the very first time that it's ever done. And so some countries were worried for good reasons and bad about setting that precedent. Mm-hmm. But the second was that, it was said 5,000. No country had actually pledged soldiers, and the UN would have had the privilege of providing the money and looking at the budget. So the countries that will provide soldiers, the question was, if Burundi disagrees and says it will look at them as an invading force, are you going to send your troops because before they land there will be shooting, there will be fighting? So those 2 dangers caused a number of countries behind the scenes to say, well, we can't approve this. And the General Assembly also, the 54 leaders, heads of state, did not approve it because they were afraid that this will lead to fighting right away and their people will be killed. Now, we found out some of the countries that did not want to approve: Egypt, and Gambia, and I believe Equatorial Guinea.
Very interesting. And of course, you also happen to know that the Peace and Security Council that you are talking about is funded not by Africans, but by the development partners.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
And
yes.
in fact, in as far as this issue was concerned of deploying 5,000 troops to Burundi, the developing partners were on the same page.
Yes.
With the Peace and Security Council.
Yes.
But what about the entire African Union, actually? Who actually funds it? Look at the headquarters, the beautiful,
yes,
headquarters in Addis Ababa, for example.
Built by the Chinese.
From Beijing. Mm-hmm. Now, is the African Union really people-centered, as sometimes we are told, or is it in fact leadership-centered?
I think that it's human nature. They are leadership-centered. My view is, especially with leadership and political leaders, politicians, you have to treat them as people who can't help themselves, and you have to hold them accountable against their wishes. So there are certain things that we shouldn't leave to them to do just because they have a good conscience. We have to have checks and balances. We have to force them. The saying I've heard here is hold their feet to the fire. They might not want to do certain things. You have to force them. And if I might say, you mentioned the development partners. As we've been talking, I was wondering whether I should throw this in. The development partners are these powerful countries around the world. They have their own agendas, and therefore they support bad leaders. It's been an obsession of mine, what they call friendly tyrants. For 50 years, there have been powerful countries that support dictators, and when you point out these are dictators, they say, that's all right, they do what we want.
For example,
the U.S. Right now, as we speak, the U.S. support, we mentioned Egypt. President Sisi the elections that he held, the parliamentary, the presidential elections and the parliamentary elections are all questionable. And I'm not just the one saying, I mean, we have democracy experts and we have democracy practitioners. We know the good democracy when we see it. So you can go around the country. We've mentioned General Kagame and what is done with the elections. That's nobody's idea of a democracy. Uganda is coming up. All these are close allies of the United States, and they are dictators and they get U.S. support. So the other quick thing I'll add is Emira and I are members of the African diaspora here. I have always thought that we are now taxpayers and citizens in some of these powerful countries. We have a right, in fact, we have an obligation to push hard and say supporting dictators in Africa is not good for Africa, it's not good for the United States, and we are American taxpayers.
Very interesting, very interesting. Of course, one could perhaps be tempted to say that in situations where you would expect the primary stakeholders in the affairs of Africa, as far as they are concerned, they are not in fact being really supported by the Africans or the primary stakeholders. The development partners have since perhaps, in fact, occupied the role of the primary stakeholders on the continent. Is that the way you see it?
Well, I think we have to begin to put forward new ways of thinking for the African Union and help the African Union to kind of position itself differently in order for it to actually reach its Agenda 2063, right, in less than 50 years' time. One of those areas is thinking about the resources of the continent differently. We've got to begin to think about issues like taxation differently, issues like flows of resources, illicit financial flows outside the continent. The African Union can begin to set up instruments through which it is able to generate resources from the continent differently in order for it to run its mechanisms, whether it's an African standby force, long discussed but never fully realized, or many of these other mechanisms that have been envisioned.
Unfortunately, time happens not to be our best.